as Toya said, I work for Future Earth, and we're a research network, an international research network, where I'm based at the Secretariat, but we have a pretty large network of research across the world working on sustainability, across many different disciplines. And one of the projects we do that we've been doing for a couple of years is the 10 new insights in climate science. And I think you should be seeing my screen now. So this is something, it originated with Patricia Espinosa, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, who is on the image now, approaching Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, asking for a review of the latest climate research. And then we worked with them, that was 4 years ago, we worked with them on that. Then we've been leading on this project then for the last 3 years, and it's something we draw together each year, and it's kind of officially received by the UNFCCC. So what we do here is trying to balance between all the different disciplines in climate research just to see kind of what is the very latest, like rather distinct things. So we're not doing a complete assessment, but looking at very concrete new things that have come in climate research kind of during the last year. Drawing on scientific research, and I thought I kind of just go through what we had for this last year, and then take some questions. So the process here is that we write this up with the experts in each field, so the disciplinary experts, and so many of the questions if you have very technical questions, might be difficult for me to answer them because it's written up by people who are really experts, but I tried as much as possible to answer what you have. So one of the first insight we have is looking at the sensitivity that the Earth has to global warming. There's something called equilibrium climate sensitivity, which is a measurement for how much the temperature increases when you double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this has shifted some between the different IPCC assessment reports. And there were some fears for the modeling that's going on for the next round of IPCC, the next assessment report. There was a fear because there were models coming in having a much higher ECS sensitivity than in previous models. So we were wondering, like, were we going to see much higher climate sensitivity, meaning that we've already kind of used up our emissions budget. But when we sat down with the experts, we can see that looking at many different types of evidence, it doesn't look like we can see a big increase in the ECS for this year, which is good. But we also see that you can kind of exclude some of the most optimistic scenarios that are built on kind of very small emissions reductions. So we're narrowing the span here. So we're still calling for very great emissions reductions, but the worst case scenarios probably won't be realized. We'll see what the IPCC says when it comes out. Another insight we had was on the permafrost. This is something that's been it's been discussed a lot in popular media, not that much I find in research. It was mentioned in the latest IPCC 1.5 degree report, but that report only looks at what's called abrupt thaw, when gradually the ground thaws kind of from upside and down. But there is another mechanism for permafrost thaw called abrupt thaw, where the ground collapses and you have lake formations, and this makes it possible for the melting to go much faster as kind of heat is transported down through the water much better than through the ground. And the abrupt thaw comes from the melting collapse of ice wedges under the ground. But so we start taking that into account, we can say that roughly there was a doubling in the emissions from permafrost, so kind of an additional 100 billion tons of carbon dioxide or so. in addition during this century. So, and that needs to be taken into consideration given the very small carbon budgets, about 200-300 billion tons that we have left for the 1.5 degree target. And kind of related to that also when it comes to land, and is looking at the whole land sink. I think when we discuss climate change, we often tend to forget that about a third of all the emissions of carbon dioxide that we emit as humans are taken up by land ecosystems. And much of that is taken up in tropical and boreal forests. But what we now see is that due to increasing deforestation, the tropical forests may have reached kind of a peak uptake, and we'll be increasingly relying on boreal forests as a carbon sink if we don't decrease the deforestation in tropical forests. And we can also see that there are we may be running into some limits on how much the land sink can respond. So previously, as you see on the graph here, the land sink has grown, so it's shown as a negative, but it's grown as the emissions have gotten higher, because the plants take up more carbon dioxide when there's a higher concentration in the atmosphere. But eventually you run into some problems there with a lack of nutrients, or there's when the environment goes drier due to climate change and other factors, also fires, meaning that we might eventually see the land sink not being able to respond in the same way to emissions. And speaking of drought, we also see that we could be going into a more severe water crisis with climate change. And we have known about this, that kind of gradually some areas could become drier. So what is new here in the research is the understanding of how much worse it will become due to mainly the extreme events. These are underrepresented in the climate models. So I think it'll be important to kind of understand this factor more, and also understand kind of how the impacts of water crisis will impact certain people worse than others. There's a big difference there in how it affects people. And also, and kind of related to that, we also see that there's been too little research and too little focus in looking at how climate change can affect our mental health. And it can happen in several ways. So one thing could be kind of the indirect effects, like anxiety or worrying about the future because climate change is going to happen, like climate anxiety in kind of Western youth. Or you can have more direct impacts, such as people being exposed to drought or rising sea levels, and maybe being forced to leave their homes. So the much more direct impacts. So this the image there in the bottom is from one of these big forest fires. This is from Texas in the US. And I think this could be even worse, as different effects will start cascading and compounding each other. But there are also ways of dealing with it. We need to be better at working with mental health in our institutions and in our healthcare, and we could also be much better at planning cities, for instance, to relieve heat stress or create calming atmospheres, what we call blue and green spaces. Then we've looked at a couple of insights related to how we respond, how we've responded to COVID. And there's been a pretty strong response. Due the restrictions that we've had has given a pretty strong response in terms of lockdowns, etc., that have given emissions reductions. And at the peak, the global peak, we had about a 17% emission reduction, and about 8.8% reduction for the whole first half of 2020. But the interesting thing, I think, here is when we start looking at the specifics, like going into different countries. On average, each country reduced their emissions by about a quarter. And much of this was due to the decreases in ground transport, but we also see that in India and China, for instance, there were big emissions reductions also from industry. But the problem is that this is unlikely to have a long-term effect. So we need to transform, and we can see that governments are currently not committing to the transformation that's needed for this. So let me just jump first here to kind of look at the graph at emissions reductions, where we can see that, as I said, the ground transport was the biggest, and this is for the global emissions. But even also aviation was a big part because this has such a big impact on that specific sector. But what we can see is that there are very big funds being allocated to restarting the economy. We're speaking about $12.7 trillion, and about $4 trillion being allocated to sectors which have a big impact on the climate. And only a part of this would need to be used or to spent on a green recovery. So I think there's a big opportunity here, but what the data is showing now is we're still spending more on kind of brown recovery than on green recovery, which is quite unfortunate. But it could also be, I think there's a recognition that it could be due to that governments are in a crisis mode, and then gradually as we kind of go out of that crisis mode, and there's an ability to think more long term, we might see more green stimulus spending. And I also think both the EU and the US governments could do more of that. Then also related to the coronavirus situation, I think it demonstrated the need that we have to rethink our governance. I think in many parts of the world we could see that there was some lacking capacity in governments to respond to the stress that was being put on societies due to the coronavirus, and we can see we could anticipate at least as much stress due to climate change. There's also late research that has come lately that has shown that climate change is not just kind of slow, gradual changes, but there could be very abrupt changes and significant crisis on the same scale as we've seen with the corona pandemic. So there's a big need to think about our governance and also think about new governance structures, like new innovative forms, and there's a big movement kind of looking at more bottom-up governance, not just thinking about it in terms of states, but many other actors coming in, like cities or social movements, etc. And these groups are becoming more and more important when it comes to governance and systems change related to climate change. And then we also see somehow related to the stimulus funds. We could see that mainly due to the very short time we have to react to the current kind of climate crisis and the very small budgets we have, it'll be very difficult to focus our economic recoveries on stimulating economic growth and simultaneously trying to meet the Paris Agreement. Like that it's a very difficult, almost impossible task to do that. So what we would like to mandate there instead is to focus rather on the sustainability. So more or less as much funds as possible when it comes to recovery should be focused to activities that are green and that are sustainable and means that we change our systems and our infrastructures, and that there is a possibility it might give a small economic growth, actually, counterintuitively. But I think if we don't do this, if we just focus on growth now, in the long term, we're going to lose both societally and economically due to the impacts of climate change. And it's also becoming more and more cost beneficial. If you look at it from a very narrow cost benefit perspective, it's become more and more cost beneficial to do these things we need to do for climate change, just because we're constantly upgrading and being better at nailing down the cost of unsustainable power. So that, for instance, coal power is so expensive in terms of an environmental health impacts that you can just shut it down and replace it with green power with a cost benefit, even if you're not looking at climate damages. And this is also helped a lot by decreasing costs for alternatives. Finally, we have looked a bit into urban electrification as one of the possible pathways for creating a transition. And I think this is kind of in recognition of that cities are important centers of innovation and of human habitats, and it's kind of one of these places we think that electrification can happen first. But there's also lots of problems here. For instance, huge areas of slums where access to electricity and clean energy could really help people in their social development. But there's a need to do, to be able to do this transition in a way where it really benefits people. So there are lots of possibilities here, but it really depends on how the transition is done. And there are lots of co-benefits also in terms of air pollution, etc. As we know, air pollution kills more people per year than the corona pandemic has done so far. Finally, there's a very interesting piece that was written up on climate litigation that is going to court because of climate change. And I think the key bit we were looking at for this is how this has changed our understanding of dealing with these kind of issues in courts. So we're not just looking at how effective it's been, but how it's actually changed the whole conversation. We look at human rights from a different perspective, and it's been really difficult for the courts to figure out who has standing here. Who can represent the interest of future generations? Who can represent the interest of an entity like a river or a forest? And there are these kind of innovative cases that have come up, particularly from Latin America and other kind of global South countries, which haven't been been there in cases from the US, etc., where we really start looking at the rights of nature as one of the reasons to take action. We can also see that this has also forced the courts to do some cross-fertilization, across the different levels, so that kind of the outcome from a national court can influence how an international court looks at an issue like climate change and human rights related to climate change. And I think it really forces courts to look at issues across borders and kind of what is the national responsibility for harm across a border. And it also has meant that in some cases a court or the juridical system goes in as more of a lawmaker. So normally you would have a certain order in how you do things, but in this situation you can go in and from the court side and stipulate that a government needs to take action and needs to pass laws. So this hasn't, and of course there are many cases where this hasn't been successful, but there are a few cases where it has, and that is really interesting then from those who study this. So these were the 10 insights. So I'm hoping that we can have a conversation kind of if you have some questions. But we've just opened the call for inputs to the 10 insights. And I can, during the conversation here, I can post the link to that in the chat box. But I'm also, opening for the possibility of having a conversation here of what we should be covering for next year. I think that would be an interesting discussion. And I think this is, if you want to influence this publication, I think this is a very good time to do so. So thanks, and back to you, Toya.
Thank you, Erik. That was great. Perfect little insights. I just thought it's really cool because we have almost one lesson of each point already been had at this forum, so to speak. And I was also thinking about the last point, number 10, the suing or the trials. There is this Aurora case now in Sweden starting up, where the young ones have gathered to try to sue the government, lack of action, just like they successfully did in the Netherlands 2019. What do you think about that?
I think it's good. I mean, I think these cases, regarding of whether disregarding whether they are effective or not, I think it really brings up an issue here when particularly young people sue the state for not taking action. I think it sends a message, and hopefully they will be successful as well and be able to force in stronger legislation. I think also it's interesting from the perspective that it removes some of the party politics, I think, in it. That becomes more a matter of the state as a whole. So disregarding which government you are, you need to, respect the laws and the juridical system.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, agree. So everybody, maybe we should move over to Swedish now, or if someone do not like that, give a shout out because it feels ridiculous to speak English now. Så jag byter till svenska. Ni får jättegärna skriva frågor i chatten så betar vi av dem i den ordning de dyker upp. Okej, vi har bara ett meddelande här från Alistair att han kan tyvärr inte stanna på frågestunden. Jag vill prata vidare lite med de här 10 punkterna här nu då. De är ju superviktiga. Jag ser dig, My. De är ju superviktiga. Hur får ni ut dessa till allmänheten, undrar jag? Hur kan ni sprida det här längre än till sådana här små forum och forskarvärlden?
Ja, alltså det är ju dels via att vi har det här samarbetet med FN kring det. Så det sprids ju via deras kanaler. Och det är någonting som vi också jobbar med, att vi ska få in det mer kraftigt liksom i de processerna, så det verkligen når alla olika förhandlare. Vi har ju också vårt nätverk, alltså vårt internationella nätverk av forskare som ofta har kopplingar till som nationella förhandlare och liknande och delegationer. Så vi brukar försöka få ut det via de nätverken så att det når de som arbetar med det. Sen jobbar vi också generellt med media. Jag tror vi fick in det väldigt mycket i svensk media i år med DN och Göteborgs-Posten och ganska många andra. Och ganska stort uppslag i DN om det. Så att det är 2 olika approacher. Nu har vi liksom en strategi för att få ut det ännu mer som vi kommer jobba med för framöver.
My, ville du säga någonting eller var det...
Jag skrev det i chatten. Jag tycker att det enklaste är att man bara skriver fråga i chatten.
Ja.
Så att det är en person i taget som ställer frågan själv bara.
Det går jättebra. Skriv bara fråga i chatten så betar vi av er. Får ni komma till tals när ni vill. Okej, det finns inga frågor för närvarande. Nej, men
jag kan komma in ändå om det passar. Kanske är det okej? Pihl här. Jag var lite mer intresserad av i början när du presenterade, när vi tittar på uppvärmningen, prediction, titta på framtiden, hur uppvärmningen är. Och du har en graf som visar ändå att osäkerheterna ser ut att krympa lite när vi tittar på uppvärmning. Och jag håller på att forska väldigt mycket om aerosolpartiklar, och aerosolpartiklar är en komponent där som verkligen som innebär att vi har en stor osäkerhet i hur vi ska uppskatta klimatet framöver. Så vid sidan om växthusgaserna så har ju de också en påverkan på strålningsbalansen och klimatet, men det är mycket, mycket svårare att komma åt hur stor den påverkan är. Och i stora hela är det en avkylande effekt. Och till skillnad mot växthusgaserna som är långlivade så är aerosolpartiklarna kortlivade. Så man kan säga att de maskerar lite den verkliga uppvärmningen som vi ser nu. Så att det är väldigt viktigt att få in dem i klimatmodeller för att med en bra uppskattning för att vi ska kunna titta på framtiden. Så i den här grafen, vet du, när man har krympt ner lite osäkerna, vet du någonting om att man har förbättrat uppskattningen av aerosolerna eller den biten? Tror att det ingår på något sätt, eller?
Som jag förstår ECS så ska väl inte aerosoler ingå. Man tittar ju på effekten av koldioxid. Och det inkluderar ju en del feedback-effekter, och man kollar ju på molnbildning och liknande. Så det man förbättrat i modellerna är ju framförallt att man förstår molnbildning och albedoeffekter. Men aerosoler som är framförallt då antropogena aerosoler borde inte finnas med i den bedömningen, utan det är någonting som behandlas externt. Däremot så är det är intressant att titta på. Jag fick en väldigt bra fallstudie av det när vi gjorde liksom nedslänkningen under coronapandemin, för att då minskade både utsläppen av växthusgaser och aerosolerna väldigt kraftigt, och det kan man ju se i den här artikeln av Forster med flera, där man får med alla olika climate forces på en gång, och att nettoeffekten är en liten lätt uppvärmning. För framförallt om man tittar på den väldigt kortsiktiga effekten är alltså en uppvärmning, för att man får bort koldioxid, men den effekten är långsiktig, och det är liksom bara en liten blipp så att säga. Alltså ett litet minskat utsläpp och sen fortsätter det släppa ut igen, men effekten på aerosoler blir väldigt kraftig och väldigt liksom, här och nu, och därför blir det framförallt en uppvärmning. Men om man däremot då skulle hålla de här nedstängningarna permanent över en längre tid, så skulle man då få en större nettonegativ effekt, för att den tillfälliga effekten av aerosolerna blir inte kraftigare eftersom den är så den är kortsiktig, men den ackumulerade effekten av minskade utsläppsminskningar skulle bli större. Jag hoppas att det är svar på din fråga.
Ja, men det var jätteintressant. Men ett tillägg bara är att aerosoler har två effekter. Dels i den molnfria atmosfären, då benämner man en direkt effekt. Men i och med att molnen bildas också av aerosolpartiklar i atmosfären och antropogena aerosoler, mänskliga aerosoler, så de påverkar molnen också. Men om man tar med bägge de effekterna är absolut associerat med stora osäkerheter, och då är det framförallt påverkan på molnen som är associerat med den största osäkerheten.
Ja.
Så det finns ändå en påverkan på molnen också. Då.
Ja, men den artikeln har jag med ett dussintal olika